It's the dogfights of dogfights. I have been seriously inundated with tweets, comments, and questions for me to make this video, and it's basically the battle between the two Google devices, the Nexus 5 and the Moto X. It's the dogfights of dogfights again right here at PhoneDog.com, so make sure to stay tuned for the Nexus 5 and the Moto X. These two will spark up my toughest comparison, will also cause all the controversy in the comments, but I'm ready. The Google Nexus 5 was and still is one of my most favorite devices ever. The simple design, especially the Stormtrooper white Nexus 5, it's just a fantastic phone. Especially the design. There's not much to it, but it looks like a classic phone, but it's only a few months old. The soft touch material on the back is, well, soft, and the camera ring is a work of art. The embossed Nexus is also a nice touch. And the overall feel is high quality enough, but it's still relatively lightweight and thin. It measures in at 8.59mm thick and only weighs 4.9 ounces. The Moto X is more or less the same thing with the addition of being a little bit more chubby. It's a weird way to explain it. The Moto X genuinely feels like the Nexus 5's little brother that's actually shorter and smaller. Unlike the Nexus 5's design of pure and simple, the Moto X has a curved look. Now you can order the Moto X with your own custom design, so I guess the Moto X will win that out in any way, but if you get just a plain Moto X, the Nexus 5 has a better overall design. Also, the Moto X measures in at 10.4mm thick and the same 4.59 ounces, but thanks to it being a little bit more compact, it feels more dense in the hand. Both of these phones have displays, obviously. The Nexus 5, as you guessed it, has a 5-inch display with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. It's an IPS LCD, but the colors are not so good as you'd expect. Some of the reds just look washed out compared to other LCD panels like the iPhone. The Moto X has a smaller 4.7-inch AMOLED display with way more color saturation than the Nexus 5. Only downside, it's 720p. Not a big deal, but if you like having pixels, this might turn you away. Spec-wise, they are basically on the same boat. Starting off with the Moto X, which has a more interesting setup anyway. The Motorola X8 architecture. It's basically a fancy phrase that means it has a total of 8 cores of processing, a dual-core CPU, a Snapdragon S4 Pro actually, a quad-core Adreno 320 GPU, and 2 contextual cores for things like voice recognition to help with touchless Google Now. Also, RAM is rated at 2 GB. Dual-core kinda sounds, well, terrible these days, but don't question the power of the Moto X. It's a serious phone in every area. The Nexus 5 has a more serious processor. It's a Snapdragon 800 processor, rated at 2.26 GHz. Obviously, it's a quad-core. It has a slightly higher rated quad-core GPU, the Adreno 330, and 2 GB of RAM. Put these two together and you'll see pretty much a similar performance. These two are really simple devices that give you the best Android experience for the least amount of money. What a beautiful thing. Now, diving into the software, you'll find similar tales on both ends. Both of them are running the latest version of Android 4.4 KitKat, but look at this one, the Nexus 5 has 4.4.2. That's the power of being a complete Nexus device. And overall, the Nexus 5 did have KitKat available for that device before the Moto X, but only by a couple of weeks. Now, one advantage the Moto X has is Motorola putting updates through the Google Play Store. Just recently, they updated the camera application and the camera gallery through the Play Store, and the press went berserk. Such a clever idea, and it was so fast and painless. The Nexus 5, well, come on, it's a Nexus. You'll never see a lack of updates until this device becomes obsolete. The experience is identical, maybe the edge to the Nexus 5 for a really stock form of Android, but the little bits of Motorola and Verizon on this phone basically are really well hidden. These two phones run the same applications, but the Nexus 5 will show a small, very small competitive edge thanks to the higher clock speed. Running a simple benchmark like Quadrant can really show what the differences are between the processors. You would expect the Nexus 5 to perform better here, but what you actually see is the Moto X scores higher in the test. Why? It's a smart architecture. The X8 configuration will push this phone just as much as the quad-core Snapdragon inside the Nexus 5. Just to show you the little difference there is, we'll load up PhoneDog.com, a pretty heavy mobile site it is, on these two devices running on the same Wi-Fi network with similar load times, and maybe you'll have a smoother experience on the Nexus 5, but not by much. Next up is battery life. This is actually going to surprise you. The Moto X has a 2200 mAh non-removable battery. My average battery life exceeds my daily usage by a couple hours, so around 9 hours to moderate usage. The Nexus 5 has a 2300 mAh non-removable battery. You would expect it to last the same or a little bit better than the Moto X. No, but Nexus 5 will last you about 6 to 7 hours for moderate usage. Usually at the end of the day, my Nexus 5 is screaming with low battery alerts, or sometimes will be completely shut off because of a drained battery. How can that be? X8, lower powered chips, plus a smaller display on the Moto X. And last but not least, my favorite section, cameras. First, let's talk numbers and sensors. The Nexus 5 has a 10 megapixel camera with a 3.4-inch sensor with relatively large pixels. The Moto X has an 8 megapixel camera with a 2.6-inch sensor with smaller and less light-friendly pixels. What's the end result? The photos are better coming off the Nexus 5. The video is a lot better coming from the Nexus 5. But the photo taking experience is much, and I mean much better on the Moto X. I just wish I could combine these two phones to have the ultimate photo taking experience. Notice how some of the Moto X photos are washed out or sometimes really have little to no detail. It almost looks blurry from some of the photos. The Nexus 5 is no king in photos, but it takes a much nicer photo than the Moto X. But the downside with the Nexus 5 is the app takes almost a second or two to actually snap the photo. I cannot believe it's that slow. So let's move on to what you really want to know, the winner. Let's tally up. The Nexus 5 is faster and has more powerful specs, but they both have great builds. The Moto X has a better looking display, although not the best pixel density or resolution, and the Nexus 5 run the most up-to-date software. Also, the Moto X has a longer lasting battery, but the Nexus 5 takes a better photo. Do you see the trend? They're almost identical and they all have different compromises, but if I had to choose, I would go the Nexus 5. Why? Because I like taking good photos on my phone, and I do not want to carry around a DSLR all the time. Maybe if you'd put the wood backing on the Moto X, and I would totally go for the Moto X. Well, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to like and comment on this video, and also follow me on Twitter at phonedog_Marco. And until next time, I'm Marco Hanna.